Another ludicrous argument that Non-Compete has come up with is a video titled "Capitalism is a Freaking Scam." Listen to this.
600 smackaroos, 700 smackaroos, 800 smackaroos. Boy, I sure do love profits.
As I've argued before, Non-Compete really doesn't understand the whole thing on profits and losses. He doesn't comprehend the very fact that the capitalist has to provide a service or product in exchange for that money, has to provide something that is going to be of benefit to the consumer. He doesn't look at wealth in terms of material wealth. A consumer is only going to part with their money for something that they're going to benefit, such as the product or service that they're getting. Businesses have in place return services. The reason why return services exist was because of consumer demand and competition.
Excuse me, Mr. the Capitalist? What do you want? May I come in? Yeah, shoot yourself. Oh, it's you, Nickelbrick, is it? Actually, it's Neckybeard, sir. Yeah, whatever. You got 3 minutes. Start talking. Well, I was hoping to talk to you about capitalism. Capitalism? What about it? Say, you're not another one of those pinko longhairs, are you? Coming in to complain about the job I was generous enough to bestow upon you? No, sir, Mr. the Capitalist, sir. Quite the contrary. See, I've always loved capitalism. My dream is to be a capitalist just like you someday. Go on. Well, see, recently I met this girl. She's really beautiful, sir, and strong and really smart. Everything I've ever dreamed of in a woman. And she tells me that capitalism is exploitative and that I'm being exploited and that I should fight against capitalism. Your girlfriend's absolutely right, kid. She's right? Yep, 100%.
The truth of the matter is, you will never get rid of exploitation 100%, and these type of people try to paint this perfect world as if you'll ever get rid of that from the economy. You have never seen a socialist economy without extreme levels of exploitation.
The United Nations human rights investigator for North Korea said he will look into allegations that 20,000 North Koreans are working in slave-like conditions in countries like China, Russia, and the Middle East.
In other words, workers working endless hours for such little pay. You saw that in every communist regime that you ever found. Socialism, you will face extreme levels of that, so it's really all a question of what system best works for limiting that problem, and it just so happens to be a capitalist system, because the only way you're going to limit that problem as best as possible is by having strong consumer choice and strong workers' choice for the worker to choose where they work, and it's through competition that enables that to limit such a problem, because then the worker has the freedom to choose to leave that company and go and work for another company.
So, capitalism is bad? Well, it's bad for you. You're a worker. It's great for me. Look at all this money I have.
I pointed out before that between 1840 to 1900, you saw wages continuously increase by 1.6% on average. Most of the wealth was going to that of the 70% of the employees, the workers. Meanwhile, 30% was going to that of the capitalists. Throughout that entire time period, the wealth distribution remained the same, so there was no dangerous concentration of wealth into the hands of the few like his type would try to argue, and there most certainly wasn't a case that the capitalist was just consuming it all for themselves and the employees were getting nothing. In fact, in 1968, they actually ran a survey of 50,000 families, and between that time period of 1968 to the mid-1990s, you could look at between 1975 to 1991, even during a time period when Ronald Reagan was the president of the United States during the 80s, what you found was the bottom 20% had moved up the ladder by $27,000 plus in wages. Meanwhile, the richest percentile only increased in wages by $4,000 plus. Again, the rich got richer, and the poor got richer faster. That completely turns his entire argument upside down, and this isn't even a capitalist system.
See, up until the 1930s, the USA was really on the skids. We all know about the Great Depression, but did you know that an overwhelming majority of Americans were anti-capitalist and in favor of socialism during that time?
But things just don't add up, otherwise you would not have seen Calvin Coolidge having become the President of the United States during the 1920s. We do acknowledge the fact that FDR did become the President, I'm sure it was in 1933. There was no high demand from the American people for social security, so they were hardly as socialist as he's making them out to be. In fact, the social security had to be propagated into place.
Roosevelt's New Deal was basically an attempt to thwart and co-opt leftist rhetoric and demands into his own platform, and it worked pretty well. He introduced socialist policies and recruited socialist leaders to prevent the rise of a socialist third party. He paid off and hired up socialist leaders into his own administration. To this day, it's widely considered that Roosevelt saved capitalism. The strategy worked well enough to stave off a socialist uprising until the 1940s.
FDR was very much sympathetic to that of the fascism in terms of his economic policies. He's the reason why the United States of America is pretty much in the mess that it's in, and that's the story of FDR. He was the one that led America to the 1938 Roosevelt recession.
So what happened in the 1940s? World War II, kid. World War II. With the war industry, government contracts and massive military drafts ensured that everyone suddenly had gainful employment. Come to think of it, the way the United States was run during the war years was a little bit like centralized communism. I never thought of it that way. After the war, because of our geographic location, we were basically one of the only developed countries that wasn't utterly devastated. Our factories were still standing, and our military efforts gave us this huge international infrastructure. The Monroe Doctrine gave us financial leverage over pretty much all of the rest of the developed world. We suddenly became the industrial powerhouse and financial leader of the entire planet.
It all goes back to Henry Hazlitt's argument on the broken window fallacy. If you don't understand what that means, it simply means that, from the outside, someone like non-compete only sees from face value. In other words, he sees the broken window and he thinks that, the glazier has now got a job and that's money in his pocket. But what he doesn't see is what goes on behind that. Essentially, the shopkeeper now has money out of his pocket that he's going to have to pay for the damaged window. And the third party in the background, which is the tailored business, has just lost work because now the butcher, the one with the broken window, now has to pay for the damages of the window, so that's money out of his pocket that otherwise would have went to the tailored suit. Well, it's no different to that of a wartime period in a wartime economy. Resources that could have been used to alternative uses, that could have went to parts of the economy to improve the material wealth of the people, whether it's shoes or clothes or food or whatever it may have been, that was reallocated to an area of the economy to basically finance a very costly war. Whilst the United States wasn't a country that was, heavily bombed, etc., it more than certainly was a country that was involved in the war, and that was costly in itself because you have to pay for all of the weaponry, etc., all the bombs, the planes, the ships. He doesn't realise that the alternative uses, had the Second World War not occurred, or had the United States of America not been involved in the Second World War, that, hypothetically speaking, wealth could have went to producing things that would have improved the material wealth of the masses elsewhere. So in other words, resources could have been used in other areas.
Starting in the 1950s, this prosperity led to a few decades of artificially inflated prosperity, especially in comparison to the rest of the world, which was struggling to rebuild from years of heavy bombing and fighting. This put the US in a great position to imperialize developing nations, and we had a huge market for exporting manufactured goods and food and crap like that.
So he's writing about the 1950s to the early 1970s, claiming about that of the time period of false prosperity. But what he completely ignores is the fact that it wasn't as capitalist as he likes to claim. In fact, throughout the 1950s to 1960s, you would see the higher tax rates as a prime example. And the higher tax rates, to quote what Tom Woods says here, via loopholes or outright tax evasion, these tax rates were not paid, as tax accountants can tell you. So as you can see, what businesses were simply doing was avoiding the tax. That's natural. Just listen to what non-compete says here.
The corporations of the United States were making so much money that it was pretty easy for them to compensate employees fairly well. Most factory workers in the 1950s and 60s were compensated, kind of fairly compared to today. Many workers had decent retirement plans, moved their families to the suburbs, bought cars, and went on vacations. We were living high on the hog.
Of course, we would know this to be completely false, given the fact that in 1971 you would see the partial gold standard stripped from the currency. The inflation would spiral out of control. The United States was close to hitting a second Great Depression, so it wasn't as rosy as he's trying to make it out to be.
And capitalism made all of that possible, right? Actually, it was capitalism that screwed all that up for everyone. By the late 1960s, capitalists were starting to figure out that they could move their factories overseas to make more money, which started driving down wages for American workers.
And here comes the argument about capitalists moving their businesses. Oh, how evil of them to do so after bombing them with high tax rates. I mean, what the hell is he expecting? Is he expecting businesses to survive on that of the higher tax rates? Of course they're going to ship their businesses elsewhere. That's what happens when you try to impose socialism. When you try to impose socialism, then businesses are going to go elsewhere. That's what they did in Venezuela. That's what they did in Chile. Investment doesn't flock to where there are higher tax rates that kills businesses. Therefore, businesses were simply moving with their feet. They were moving away because of the higher tax rates that they could not sustain running business in. Therefore, it was only natural that it was cheaper for them to ship their business off to that of China.
Ever since those days, the little boost we got from World War II has been winding down. The rest of the world has been bouncing back to full strength, and our artificial prosperity has been coming to an end. The world is starting to equalize, my boy. It may seem like things are getting worse for us here in the United States compared to the way they were for our grandparents, but in truth, they're just going back to normal, and capitalism is doing what it's always done, generating chaos and spinning wildly out of control.
Again, this is based on the argument as if to say that the United States throughout the 20th century was somehow free market. The fact of the matter is, the United States during the 20th century has been more and more corporatist. That's anti-capitalism.
Anyway, if capitalism is running its course and leading us into crisis, then why are you a capitalist? Because I'm a greedy prick, Nerky Bread. It's Necky Beard. Whatever. Anyway, I'm a capitalist because I love money and power. I'm accustomed to a certain lifestyle, you see. A lifestyle that involves helicopters and very large boats. Exploiting workers is the only way to keep myself in yachts, so I'm gonna keep riding this pony for as long as I can hold on.
It's rather quite convenient that he's trying to take the piss out of, the capitalist, that he's a greedy pig and all the rest of this, and he's waving about this paper money. Now I can tell you the capitalists would not be waving about paper money, and they wouldn't be reliant upon the paper. The capitalists would be smart enough to, hold all the assets that which they do. They invest in things like gold and silver, etc., because they know fine well that the average person is going to be left with the paper, and the paper is going to devalue into nothing. Meanwhile, the capitalist is the one that's going to hold all the assets, such as that of real money, of what they've invested in, and you can't say that people haven't been warned about that. So it's rather quite stupid, and it's uneducated to say that the capitalist is the one waving about paper, as if that's what the capitalist holds value in, is worthless paper.